Good morning. My name is Tom Cole. I'm an engineer with based in Miami, Florida, where we support the United States Southern Command. I've been associated with the command since I was an analyst in 1982. This unclassified brief on insurgency and counterinsurgency, however, represents solely my views and neither the views of nor the United States Southern Command.
The Southcom Theater, our experience in Latin American insurgencies, unfortunately, is fairly rich. The Castro's party, the 26th of July movement, was formed in 1955, took power in 1959, remains in power as the sole political party, the Cuban Communist Party. 1964, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC, was formed and remains the largest insurgency in the Western Hemisphere. The same year, the National Liberation Army was formed and remains active, if diminished. The M19, which had its heyday in the 1980s, has transitioned to a political party. Sandinista National Liberation Front in Nicaragua, formed in 1961, took power in 1979 over Somoza, stepped down from power in 1990 following elections, and was re-elected and returned to power in 2006. In Guatemala, the Rebel Armed Forces, the Revolutionary Organization of People in Arms, and the Guerrilla Army of the Poor, all Marxist-Leninist insurgencies, had their heyday in the 1980s and transitioned to a political party in 1998. The Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front almost took power in El Salvador in the 1980s and transitioned to a political party. The Maoist Sendero Luminoso, or Shining Path, insurgency in Peru, much diminished following the counterinsurgency efforts by Fujimori's government, remains active. And Marta, following the takeover of the Japanese ambassador's residence, has been extinguished. Now, what is an insurgency? We'll define it very simply as an armed political struggle to depose or radically change a regime. Terrorism itself is a technique used in an insurgency, and guerrilla warfare, as we typically think of it, is a phase of an insurgency. Along those lines, I'd like to present a generic model of insurgency in 5 stages. The first stage we'll call building of forces in silence. Now, this is characterized by covert cells which conduct political action, perhaps, but not yet have started the armed struggle part of their phase. They gather and they cache weapons, but do not yet use them. They recruit, they train, and they plan. And here we see an arms cache in Fallujah. And whether a country recognizes it or not, every country in the world is in at least stage 1 of insurgency. Phase 2 we'll call terrorist attacks. And this is characterized by bombings, assassination of regime characters, bank robberies, kidnappings, and extortion in order to gather money and resources, and propaganda both domestically and internationally. And in the right, we see a roadside IED explosion in Iraq. Now, guerrilla warfare is classically what we think of as an insurgency, and this is characterized by ambushes of regime forces, guerrilla patrols where they maneuver and retreat. They have camps, but they're clandestine and hidden in the jungle or the outback, and they're moved around. They do conduct international arms smuggling in order to increase their potentials for armed struggle. And they continue to conduct violent acts such as bombings and from the first phase. Here we see in Colombia a FARC training unit on patrol. Fourth stage we'll call the guerrilla army stage. This is when the guerrillas actually control territory. The physical control of part of the national territory is a hallmark of a succeeding and perhaps on the verge of successful insurgency. It's a very bad sign. The guerrilla army forms. It begins to equip, operate, and train and maneuver and act more like a regular army. They conduct multi-unit attacks on security forces. If the army does incurse into their territory, they may retreat and then come back later, but increasingly they begin to act more like a guerrilla army in the field. The violence level in the country is viewed as insupportable, both by people domestically and by international observers. The morale of the security forces continues to deteriorate, and there's a crisis in confidence in the legitimacy and the stability of the regime. Here we see a FARC unit in formation. The fifth stage we'll call victory. This stage is characterized by the withdrawal of international support for the regime. The domestic crisis and confidence heightens. There's massive desertions in security forces. The regime leaders abscond. El Presidente flees the country. The regime basically collapses, disappears on the field, as opposed typically to being defeated in set battles. And this is victory for the insurgents. And here on the right we see in July 1979, in the front of the National Palace, two Sandinista comandantes congratulating each other on their survival and the success of their struggle. Now, Mao had a framework for insurgency, and he had three phases. A strategic defensive encompassed phase 1 and 2. In this model, what he called strategic stalemate, which is the give and take, would be phase 3, and his strategic counteroffensive would be stages 4 and 5 here. So even though this 5-stage insurgent model is basically one of my own invention, it's pretty much harmonious with most of what you'll read about insurgencies. Actually, there's a 6th stage, and that's counter-revolution. And after the insurgents have taken over, they themselves face an insurgency by reactionary forces and international enemies. Now, the important thing about this model, and the reason I really bother to bring it up, is to point out something I think is very important, and that is progression is not linear. Typically, you do not go from stage 1 smoothly to stage 5. In fact, most insurgencies never get to stage 5. There have been hundreds of insurgencies in the 20th and 21st century, and really only a handful of them have succeeded. Most insurgencies move up and down between stages 2 and 4. So a realistic goal is not eliminating an insurgency entirely. As a matter of fact, you remember my contention that all nations are at least in stage 1, whether they recognize it or not. But really, a realistic goal is to repress the insurgency to the lowest stage as possible. And that is a give and take situation and an ongoing struggle. Now, that generic model of insurgency obviously doesn't fit every situation. It's just a useful framework, I believe, in thinking about insurgencies. There are many different types of insurgencies, and most students come up with their own taxonomy. O'Neill, in his book, for example, Insurgency and Terrorism, came up with these characterizations. I'll only talk about the top 3. Anarchy is the belief that no government is good government. Bigger idea in the 19th century than the 20th century. We did have the black cells in the 1970s. All the Marxist-Lenin insurgencies, including the FARC and most of the ones I've mentioned so far, he characterizes as egalitarian based upon their promise that following the victory that men will be equal. And the third characterization is a very important one to us today. What he calls traditionalists, like the Hezbollah or Al-Qaeda, are people who believe that there's an ideal time in the past, and their insurgency is an attempt basically to reset the clock of history back to this more ideal time. Now, in counterinsurgency, which is the field manual of the U.S. Army and United States Marine Corps, they don't actually break it down quite like that. They do have a breakdown by what they call approaches. I'll mention some of those. Conspiratorial, according to the field manual, that's when you have a vanguard. It's basically a Leninist approach, a vanguard which conspires to overthrow the government. Military focused, that's basically Che Guevara's idea of a focal, a guerrilla unit in the field conducting military operations to kind of spark a insurrection. And then the urban approach, which is the IRA and much of the Iraqi resistance. So, of course, there's different models to apply. This is the current breakdown in the field manual. I'll mention the last one, composite, because in Iraq, the field manual says, oh, by the way, we really have a mix of approaches and affiliations. Take this time to talk a little bit about asymmetric. An idea that's been around, but it's so important to counterinsurgency operations that it bears some going into, and that's the asymmetry between the insurgents and the counterinsurgents. Basically, civilization is based on trust. Now, in Europe, in America, we pioneered the skyscraper. Here's the Flatiron Building in New York City, 1905, cast iron. Civilized countries throughout the world have adopted the skyscraper technology, the Petronas Towers in Malaysia, and of course the Twin Towers. Aviation pioneered in America. By the 1970s, reached great heights in the SR-71 Blackbird. The space shuttle has been termed one of the most complicated, if not the most complicated machine ever built. And aviation, a worldwide industry and characteristic of our current civilization. This is what we built. This is what we brought to the table. And this is what we have invested billions of dollars into. What they need is 19 men who are willing to die, take some pilot training, and the technology they bring to the table is the box cutter. And that results in $1 trillion and thousands of people dying. Devastation. That's asymmetry. Asymmetric very much favors the insurgent. It's much more difficult to build and maintain a civilization than it is to attack it. Our civilization is open and it's based upon trust. If somebody wants to interfere with that, it is not that difficult. Now, looking at successful counterinsurgencies over the years, in books like David Galula's book about counterinsurgent warfare, they seem to have multiple thrusts. And it's not just military, but military pressure on the insurgents, making it difficult for them to continue to make the decision to stay in the field, is a component. Security for the population, Galula stresses over and over, is key. Not only do they need to feel generally safe, but the people need to feel that they can safely help the regime stay in power. If the regime can't protect them to do that, then they're not going to help the regime. Some sort of economic stability where the basic needs of the people are met, and political hope, not only on the part of the populace, but also on the part of the insurgents. They need to have the hope that there is a way to achieve their ends that is peaceful and not violent. Now, the field manual has a chapter dedicated to intelligence and says that counterinsurgency is driven by intelligence, and it's intelligence about people, with an emphasis on the population, the host nation, and the insurgents. Intelligence, the field manual says, is a bottom-up affair, and every soldier and every Marine is a collector, as well as a user. The types of intelligence are required, according to the field manual and other sources. One of them is census, who everybody in the country is, issuance of ID cards, and where they live, where they work. Knowledge of the people is very important. And then cultural intelligence, insight into their culture, their perception, the values, decision-making of individuals and groups, as according to the field manual. Of course, about the threat, the leadership, what nodes, what's their motivations, what's their grievances, and whatnot. Now, the field manual goes into the intelligence preparation of the battlefield, what they describe as the operational environment, which has civil considerations, the areas, the structures, the people, the history, the organization, the government in the area of operations, their culture, their networks, their language, their religion, etc. It's fairly all-encompassing, the information requirements in order to conduct counterinsurgency, according to the doctrinal statement. Also, in counterinsurgency, the field manual says there's a requirement to evaluate the threat. What are the insurgents' goals? What grievances do they genuinely have, or do they cynically exploit in order to gain sympathy among the people? What other means do they use to generate support? What are their organization and exact locations? Their leadership is excellent intelligence. Intelligence in counterinsurgency is very much focused on human intelligence. In Slow Burn, a Vietnam-era CIA intelligence officer goes into the importance of building what he calls a data bank, which we would call a knowledge base today, needed to drive interrogations. And this is fairly all-encompassing. It's used to press the detainees, people you're interrogating for important details, cross-checking their stories and catching them in lies. So it's built up piece by piece. It's hand in glove with interrogation. Now, the technology they used in this book was the index card. It was pre-electronic computation. Nevertheless, he describes a knowledge base that today we would envy using any technology. So it's not so much the tools as it is the tool wielding, and it's really not so much about the tool wielding, it is about the data. Besides intelligence, there's other technical support required for counterinsurgent operations, according to the field manual. We need to model the insurgency and have a continuous assessment of the counterinsurgency campaign. There's also support required for information operations, which is an important component of the counterinsurgency, and also restoring the economic infrastructure. These are all technical ways to support in counterinsurgency. I'll finish up by taking a very brief look into the Iraqi insurgency. The reason for doing that is to focus on the situation that the country finds itself in, engaged in a war in Iraq and, of course, Afghanistan. Now, the field manual describes this as a composite insurgency which takes parts from all those different types of approaches. So we're going to quickly look at 3 segments and focusing just on their grievances and their motivations and perhaps their strategy, starting with Al-Qaeda. Now, what are their grievances? If we look at one of their doctrinal statements, which is the fatwa issued in 1998 by bin Laden, al-Zawahiri, and the rest, they mention 4 grievances against the West. That includes Western military occupation of the Arabian Peninsula, American infidel boots on the ground, British boots on the ground in Arabia is offensive to them, and what they view as the political domination of Arab governments. Like pigs at a trowel are Western attacks on Muslims and the killing of women and children in Gaza Strip and West Bank and Muslims worldwide. They claim their terrorism is a reaction to a genocidal attack on Muslims, and of course support of Israel. Now, more specifically in Iraq, the Director of National Intelligence has posted a letter that was captured in Iraq from al-Zawahiri, the number 2 guy in Al-Qaeda, to al-Zarqawi in 2005. The year before Zarqawi's death. And in this letter, al-Zawahiri says that the victory of Islam requires first the creation of a caliphate in the manner of the Prophet. This is a reference to the Salafistic or Age of Caliphate idea, the traditionalist idea that we need to return to the time of the Prophet and his successors. As shown here is a map of the various ages of the caliphs in Muhammad's time in the Saudi Arabian Peninsula and then spreading out from there. Zawahiri is pretty specific about what he says this caliphate should start out as, at least. He says the Levant, Egypt, the Arabian Peninsula, and Iraq. That area is shown in black here against a map of the U.S. CENTCOM AOR. Al-Zawahiri mentions 4 phases. 1, expel the Americans from Iraq. 2, immediately establish an Islamic emirate in Iraq and develop it and grow it. And then extend the jihad to secular countries around Iraq. And then finally the clash with Israel. So these are some of the grievances and the strategies of Al-Qaeda. Another component is the Sunni, or perhaps we could call it the Arab nationalist reaction. Here we have a quote from an interview with a leader of the Iraqi national resistance, which was broadcast on PBS. I'll let you read this. The key point that it seems important to me is this sense that the occupation is an insult to his dignity and the dignity of his people, and that there's an equation between occupation and resistance. Now, turning now to Shia grievances, they might encompass U.S. and support and British support of the Shah, shown here the Shah and Khomeini, perception of U.S. support of Saddam Hussein during the 1980-1988 Iran-Iraq war. Of course, the Iranians predominantly Shia. After Desert Storm, there was a call for an uprising, and the U.S. failed to support the uprising. In fact, thousands of people did rebel against Saddam. They were put down, and thousands were killed or tortured or driven from their homes. Many of those people were Shia, and that's a continuing grievance. And finally, like the Sunni Iraqis, the sense that the U.S. or infidel occupation of their homeland is offensive. In conclusion, insurgencies rarely succeed, but they rarely die. They usually increase or decrease in virulence. Sometimes they transition to a legitimate political party. Asymmetry definitely favors the insurgent, and of course counterinsurgency is exceedingly difficult. The Army Marine Corps doctrine calls for many things, among them a large, well-integrated knowledge base and the use of other technologies. Should focus its research and development efforts in support of counterinsurgency. Now, we will either get it right, or we'll get an opportunity to get it right the next time. And the next time will be a larger and harder problem. This is a Marine Corps Counterinsurgency Patrol, Ann Arbor, Iraq, 2005. Some sources and recommended reading. Some of these I've already mentioned. Nagel's book is also often cited, Learning to Eat Soup with a Knife.
There are 3 other sources that I've mentioned. This concludes my brief. Here's my contact information and a photograph of me from 1985 in front of the National Palace in Managua, Nicaragua, and a more recent photograph. Please contact me if you have any questions about this brief. Thank you for your attention.